Hello and welcome back to Demand Management. My name is Dr. Suzanne Van Hove and I'll be your instructor. We concluded the last module with a discussion around the activities of demand management. So now we need to review the roles, triggers, inputs and outputs, and the interfaces to demand management, the information management activities of demand, the various metrics, and we'll conclude with a sample exam question. In the previous module, we discussed the various activities within demand management, so now we need to look at the roles. We'll have a demand management process owner, as always, that will perform the generic activities. Those generic activities were delivered in an earlier module, or you could review them in Chapter 6 of the Service Strategy or Service Design volume. Additionally, the demand management process owner will work with the other process owners to have that integrated approach to the design and implementation of demand management. Remember, we talked quite strongly on the fact that most processes as well as IT activities don't consider their impact on demand in their planning. So we would want to make sure that that process owner is involved as other service management processes are designed and developed. The demand management process manager will fulfill the generic activities as previously discussed. They'll also identify and analyze the PBAs and identify and analyze the UPs. So making sure that we understand the patterns of business activity and the user profiles. They'll assist service design activities to meet the PBAs and match them up to business outcomes. They'll ensure that there's adequate capacity to meet the demand of the service and making sure that it is available through good forecasting and work with capacity management. They'll balance the cost and the value of delivering additional resource to those services, and then also put in mitigation effects if need be because of various constraints on those resources. They'll proactively prevent or manage the over and underutilization of the resources, and they'll also manage the utilization of resources to meet the fluctuating demand. So again, those activities to meet overcome the overutilization or the underutilization, we can do differential charging, we can move or extend service hours, etc., or increase capacity if we have the budget. The triggers for demand management would be a customer request for a service or a change to service. So it comes from BRM or service portfolio management, service level management. A new service concept comes in to meet a strategic initiative. Again, that would come from service portfolio management. To define or refine a service model or a PBA or a UP. So that would be based on the review of how resources are being used, and maybe our model is not correct, maybe our profiles aren't quite correct and we need to update and match the current working operations within the organization. Another trigger would be the utilization of services that are creating performance issues or that we're breaching SLAs. So we're overutilizing and we haven't gotten up to date with the change in work patterns. The forecasted PBA is incorrect or inaccurate, so we need to make that update. The inputs and outputs for demand management, they're shown for you here on the diagram. So the inputs to demand, remember, this is a process that wants information. So it's just going to be compiling information from wherever they can get it. So if there's an initiative for a new or changed service, the customer portfolio, the application portfolio, the service portfolio, the agreement portfolio, the project portfolio, service models, business changes, the business strategy, so many of them will become the inputs for demand so that we understand how services will be used. The outputs of demand management, the two main ones, would be a user profile and the patterns of business activity. The other outputs would be process-based policies as well as our shared activities with related processes such as capacity, availability, continuity. We'd also have some outputs that would be how we would document differentiation within the offering, so that would go back to service level management, service catalog, so that we can manage the demand of those services. The various interfaces for demand management, well, we have strategy management, portfolio, finance, business relationship, service level, and capacity. So in this grouping, we've hit most of those relationships except for strategy. We've generically stated we need to understand the IT strategy and the business strategy, and that's going to come from strategy management for IT services. So it's an information source for demand management as they perform their activities. Other interfaces include availability, continuity, change, configuration management, service validation and testing, and event management. Now, we've talked about this grouping as well, a little bit of extra information on service validation and testing. We talked about it in terms of that would consume resource as we perform the testing of services, whether or not they meet requirements. We also need service validation and testing to test whether or not our countermeasures from overuse or restricted demand actually work. The last one of event management is an interesting one, and this is a basis from, or an offshoot from, capacity. Event management is basically an automated process that will scan the infrastructure and monitor performance. And as performance, as we've defined them, would hit an upper or lower threshold, a notice would go out. Well, demand management would want to be tied to event management so that we could have a precursor or be proactive in meeting elevated demand levels. So that's a nice relationship with event management. Realize that those thresholds would most likely be defined and set by or provided by capacity. How do we manage information? Well, what information do we need to manage? Well, again, we're going to be talking about the service portfolio, the customer portfolio, the project portfolio. All of them would have a great deal of input into the activities of demand management. We would also have the meeting minutes between business relationship managers and customers so that we understand the future direction of the organization as well as the future consumption of services. We would also want to have access to the service level agreements because they would provide a baseline for the previous demand levels of a service, and they would also define the limits or policies for future utilization. So that agreement with the customer could reflect how we as an organization will manage demand or the limited resources that we might have. We'd also want to have a relationship with the configuration management system, where we can map service assets, customer assets, and business assets or business outcomes together, again, providing information for us to create that pattern of business activity. There are other information sources, and I encourage you to review this information in the service strategy volume just so that you have the full picture. These are the main information sources and the others that we've talked about in the module. Metrics that we would use to measure the goodness of demand management or whether or not it's fulfilling its role. Again, metrics, use them with a grain of salt. Choose metrics that mean something to your organization. So a CSF for demand management is that the service provider has identified the PBAs and is able to use them to understand the levels of demand on a service. Great, that's an outcome of the process. Now, how do we measure that? Well, we can measure that as a KPI. The PBAs are defined for each relevant service. PBAs are translated into workload information by capacity management. So we can see the outcome of the information from the patterns of business activity in terms of managing demand. Another CSF would be that the service provider has identified user profiles and is able to use them to understand the profiles of the different types of users. Okay, so I bet you the measures are going to be similar. That we have documented UPs and they contain a demand profile for services used by that user type. So in other words, have we the documentation in how we deliver the service and how we plan for capacity for now and in the future. So that should be reflected in the capacity plan as well as in the demand management documentation. could also be in the service design documentation that would be associated with that service design package, could be in appendices to an SLA, etc. So there's a lot of different places where that piece of information could show up. Another CSF would be the process exists where services are designed to meet PBAs and business outcomes. So we could measure whether or not demand management activities are included in the requirements gathering for a new or changed service. Another CSF would be that there's a means to manage situations where demand exceeds capacity. So this is that overutilization or undercapacity situation. So do we have policies in place or techniques that are documented in the capacity plan, in the SLA, that describes how we'll meet those situations? So it could be one of differential charging, extending service hours, etc. The challenges for demand, this is what people don't like. You know, when we put constraints on service use, we've paid for a service, we expect to use it. Now you're telling us that we don't have enough resource to deliver the service. This gets to be a really touchy situation. So the challenge is that we have the availability of accurate information about business activities so that we can accurately forecast. Another challenge is that demand is not included in the requirements gathering, and then as soon as you go live with the service, you don't have enough resource. Another challenge would be the breaking down of the business processes so that IT can understand the consumption of resource. Lastly, another challenge could be the lack of a formal portfolio management process or the service portfolio itself, where we don't understand what services are actually being delivered. That's an issue, and it's an issue for beyond demand management. The risks associated with demand management, fairly we can flip those challenges over into risks, but one of the main risks, lack of accurate configuration management information. We don't know what our resources are, so how can we then plan for capacity when we need it? Another risk is no service level management or poor service level management. So we don't have any commitment to utilization or service levels. So it's kind of like a free-for-all that, hey, here's a service, anybody can use it, and we don't have any control or understanding how services are used. So we don't have any constraints or policies around agreements with the customer on service use. Okay, so at this point in time, go ahead and download those sample papers. If they're from the download section of the course page, you can answer question number 4 from sample paper 1 and question number 7 from sample paper 2. Once you've completed those 2 questions, make sure you read the justifications, read all of the justifications, and make sure that you understand why each question is scored as it is. If you've missed a question, make sure that you review the information that's been provided here, as well as any and all resources you have at your disposal, and hopefully that includes the official volumes from the ITIL library. Thanks so much for joining us.